Mr. Jackson, before everybody joined, I have done a lot of trainings in Texas and Oklahoma, among my other places that I've been, and been throughout the whole state, and done a number of trainings in the Dallas area. So it's always a pleasure to talk to Texans, and particularly, excuse me, I just had dinner, and that sausage may be coming up on me. But no, we have a particular interest in outreach to Native American communities because it is truly underserved when it comes to animal welfare issues, and for that matter, all family violence issues. And it's exciting for me to speak to your group and see how much interest you have in this. What I'm going to be talking about today is kind of an abbreviated version of the trainings we do for professional audiences working in the domestic violence field. And I just need to caution you that, the topics we're going to be talking about today are very uncomfortable to deal with. They're not easy to absorb. There won't be anything graphic or anything truly distressing, but the things that we see in violence prevention and that we just kind of take for granted, we forget that people in the general public just may react to them a little bit differently. So I just wanted to let you know a little bit about that. As Linda said, I'm the head of the National Link Coalition. I'll tell you a little bit about that. That's my email address down there. And there's our website, nationallinkcoalition.org. And we have a lot of free resources. And we publish a free monthly newsletter called the Link Letter. And if you'd like to receive that, just send me an email and just tell me you were part of this webinar today. And we will be more than pleased to put you on there. You won't get spammed, you won't get any junk mail. We don't sell your name to anybody or anything like that. The diagram you see there explains what the link is all about. It's 4 interlocking circles. And it shows that animal abuse, child abuse, elder abuse, and domestic violence are all linked. They overlap. And the problem is we live in a highly specialized society, and people who work in those fields have blinders on. They work in silos, and they have an amazingly difficult job to do without a lot of resources. And until recently, they have not thought about cross-fertilizing and working with each other because they got enough to do in their own particular field. The link brings them together to recognize that no one area has all the resources to solve the problems. And by pooling those resources and working together and recognizing that we're all dealing with the same issues of violence and power and control, and we're dealing with the same families, and we're dealing with the same perpetrators and the same types of violence, then we can do a much better job and create safer and healthier communities. So we're training professionals in those 4 areas to be on the lookout for the other 3 areas of the link and to know who to call and report suspected abuse in those other areas if they happen to see it. Some of the key takeaways for what I'm going to talk about tonight, and I'll be more than open for questions and answers at the end. So let's just save the questions till then. The first thing we have to recognize is that animal abuse is bad. It certainly hurts animals, but it is a human welfare issue. It's a human safety issue as well. And animal abuse often means a risk of increased violence against people. People have what we call the human-animal bond, and the animals have the bond as well. Most of you probably have pets. You're deeply attached to them. They're important members of your family. You worry about them. They love you. And that bond gets even more intense during times of crisis or experiences of violence. And for women in particular going through domestic violence, the animals may be the only source of comfort that they have, the only buffer they have against the violence and the chaos and everything else going on in their lives. By the way, when I'm talking about domestic violence, I'm going to assume it's a man attacking a woman, because that's the most common model. We have women who attack men. We have intimate partner violence in same-sex relationships, but just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to assume it's a man hurting a woman. Victims or survivors of domestic violence, unfortunately, are often unwilling to leave unless they can take their pets with them. And the abusers recognize that, and they use that as a tool to keep the family held hostage. And I'll show you some statistics coming up. It is a severe problem. We have some great solutions to it. The fact is the national average now is that abused women takes them 7 or 8 times before they finally work up the courage to leave for good, because there are a lot of barriers keeping her from leaving. One of those barriers is fear of what will happen to their pets if they leave. And the abusers know that, and they warn the family that if they leave, the animals will die or get hurt. And in fact, one study in Indianapolis recently found that when there's animal abuse in this whole mix, it often takes her as many as 50 different prior incidents before she finally realizes she has to leave. By taking care of the animal members of our family and by paying attention to them, social service workers in all of these fields can do a much better job of assisting their human clients. And if they don't pay attention to the animals, it's hindering their ability to help the clients. Unfortunately, most people in the social services areas have not received training in this. Only a handful of schools of social work in this country even mention the fact that people have animals and that animals are considered important members of their family. So they don't pay attention to it. And that is a very unfortunate gap in their training and their understanding. And conversely, there are enhanced benefits to people when their animals can heal with them. And so if we can get the animals into the domestic violence shelters with the families, with the human members of the family, they can all recover together. And we have ways to do that, which I'll explain here very shortly. I got here through kind of a circuitous route. I started out as a newspaper reporter, and through a fluke, I wound up with the local Humane Society in Colorado Springs as their community outreach and education and publicity director. And this was back in 1973. And so I'm going around Colorado Springs teaching kids about being kind to animals. And a couple of things happened to me back in the 1980s that I like to call light bulb moments. The light bulb went on. I said, wow, why didn't I ever think about that? And things suddenly went on my radar screen that we in the humane field had just not really thought about before. One was a research study that crossed my desk from my alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania. And a woman in the School of Social Work there had done her paper and looked at a year's worth of data from the Child Protective Services Agency and the SPCA, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, in Bucks County, which is the county just north of Philly. And she found that in 9% of the cases, they overlapped. They were dealing with the same families, but child protection and animal protection weren't talking to each other. They had their blinders on. They were working in silos. And I remember looking at that thinking, that's really ironic, because the child protection movement came from the humane movement. The first child abuse cases in this country were prosecuted by humane societies. And that pattern held until the 1960s, when it began taking over by government agencies. About the same time, I was doing an in-service training for some teachers in Colorado Springs. And I brought in a local veterinarian to talk to them about pet care. And I had one of those light bulb moments. I said, Doc, every teacher in this room is mandated by Colorado state law to report suspected child abuse. And I know that anybody in human health has to report child abuse. But what about veterinarians? I mean, you've had the same medical training as a physician. In fact, your work is even more difficult because your patients can't tell you where it hurts and you got to deal with multiple species. Do you have to report suspected child abuse? I had no idea what he was going to say. We thought a minute. He said, as a matter of fact, I do. It turns out Colorado was the only state in the country that had the foresight to recognize that veterinarians might in fact see abused children. In 49 states, it wasn't on their radar screen. And I said, wow, that's interesting. I said, let me take that one step further. Would you have to report suspected animal cruelty to me at the Humane Society? And he said, no, why would I ever want to do that? I might lose a client. And I remember thinking, boy, what's wrong with that picture? Shouldn't veterinarians be at least as proactive in fighting animal abuse as physicians and pediatricians are in fighting child abuse? And then shortly thereafter, I was the after-dinner speaker at the Colorado Springs Domestic Violence Safe House annual meeting. And I was waiting to go on. I was looking at some of their literature to get a feel for who I was talking to. And I opened up one of their newsletters. And there on page 3 were these 4 drawings that had been drawn by children in the shelter. And 3 of the 4 pictures were of animals that have been killed or tortured by daddy or mommy's abusive boyfriend as a way to warn them that if they acted up, they would be next. And I remember thinking, boy, this is a whole aspect of animal abuse we have never really thought about. This is 40 years ago now. Well, fast forward to 2008, and 25 of us who'd been working independently in this area across the country, actually around the world, got together in a hotel room in Maine. We just started this group, the National Link Coalition. Today, we have 4,500 people in all 50 states and 55 countries who get our monthly newsletter, the Link Letter, our free newsletter. And we are all working together, and it's multidisciplinary. We have psychologists, we have human health professionals, law enforcement, prosecutors, child protection, domestic violence, adult protection, you name it. It's a multidisciplinary approach to create more healthy and happy communities. And we work in public policy and seeing what laws are going on around the country. And we're following 122 state law bills and 2 in Congress right now. We showcase great programs around the country. We do trainings for groups like this and professional audiences. And we keep track of research, over 1,500 citations in our bibliography. We start local link coalitions, and we have one in North Texas, based out of the Texas SPCA in Dallas. And our motto for all this is very simple. When animals are abused, people are at risk. And when people are abused, animals are at risk. It's really just as simple as that. We now have decades of research linking animal cruelty with intimate partner violence or domestic violence. The animals, unfortunately, become soft targets of these threats and violence, and it's a way to coerce and control the women and the children. The animal abuse may be the earliest warning sign of a family in trouble, because neighbors are more likely to report animal abuse because a lot of it occurs outdoors where the neighbors can see it, but also they know the dog can't pick up the phone and dial 911. And often people say, well, the way a man and his wife get along, that's their business, and she's a grown woman. She can do whatever she wants. She can leave anytime she wants to. And they figure how somebody disciplines their child is their own business, but they do feel sorry for the animals. And so they will report it. And so consequently, whoever investigates animal cruelty in a community is really the first point of intervention. But you'll see there's an asterisk there, because there is absolutely no consistent pattern in Texas or anywhere in the country in terms of who that investigating agency is. And we put together the National Directory of Abuse Investigation Agencies of 6,500 counties and cities across the country, and it's a mess. For example, just in Dallas County alone, there are 22 different agencies that somebody could call. In Tarrant County, there's 16 different agencies. And I don't know if you folks are in any of the other counties, but if you go to our website, nationallinkcoalition.org, you'll see the abuse in directory there. Just click on Texas and all 267 counties, and you'll see exactly how many agencies there are. And so in any state in this country, there's one hotline to call for child abuse, and there's one hotline to call for domestic violence, and there's 2 numbers to call for elder abuse, but there can be 600 or more different agencies to call to report suspected animal abuse. We're encouraging people in these various professional fields to look at the family violence through this lens of the link, because it's a better way to protect all victims, to intervene early, and to create coordinated, integrated, multidisciplinary teams and coordinated community response teams that include the animal care and control agencies in the community. And traditionally, they've been left out because people think, oh, it's only an animal. What do we know about pets and families? I'm thinking many of you have pets. Hopefully most of you do, and you know what I'm talking about. But people who don't work in the animal field aren't familiar with how prevalent they are. More homes in this country have pets than have children. We spend more money in America on pet food than we do on baby food. There are more dogs in the United States than there are people in any country in Europe except Germany. And there are more cats in the United States than dogs. Children's literature and media and vocabulary, it's just saturated with animals. When children learn to speak, once they get past mama and dada, it's doggy and ducky and kitty and horsey. Gail Melson, who did research on this at Purdue University in Indiana, found that fairy tales have more animals in them than fairies. And she also found that a child in America today is more likely to grow up with pets than with a live-at-home father. So we're encouraging anybody who works with children, whether it's ministers, counselors, teachers, child welfare workers, pediatricians, anybody working with kids, if they're not asking them about their animals and finding out how the animals are treated and the emotional attachments that the kids have or don't have for their animals, they're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. And particularly for abused children, that pet may be the child's only source of affection that's available 24/7. It doesn't have to be a dog. It can be a bird, it can be a hamster, it can be a tank full of fish. There are a lot of animals out there. These are some numbers from Texas. Texas is what, 28 million people and about 7 million children. It was about 7.5 million dogs. Not quite as many cats, but there are more dogs in Texas than there are children. And that pattern is true in many states in this country. 43% of Texas households have dogs, 20% have cats. And that's important to legislators. And there's a great group in Austin. It's the Texas Humane Legislative Network that works on animal welfare bills. Because legislators often say, well, dogs and cats don't vote. Well, that's true, but their owners do. And a lot of them are pet owners. And pets are overwhelmingly found in homes with children. More than 2/3 of homes with kids under age 6 and almost 3/4 of homes with children over age 6 have pets. And the woman in the household is overwhelmingly the caregiver. If it's livestock, that's something that the guys do. But when it's household pets, that's the woman's primary responsibility. And that emotional attachment that the women in the family have becomes a point of vulnerability that abusers will exploit. And it also means that veterinarians play a role in this, because who goes to the vet on Saturday morning to get the rabies shots? It's mom with a couple of kids in tow and the dogs and the cats. So the vet can see 3 of the 4 primary victims of family violence. Our view of pets in America has changed dramatically. According to the American Veterinary Medical Association, 99% of us consider pets to be companions or family members. Only 1% of us think of pets as property. But here's where a disconnect comes in, because in the eyes of the law, pets are property. They're called chattel property. It's the same Latin root as cattle. And they are in the exact same legal category, unfortunately, as a toaster. But no battered woman ever ran back to her abuser to rescue her toaster, but they'll go back time and time again because they're afraid of what will happen to their animals. This emotional bond, like I said, is at most intense during times of crisis. We saw this over and over and over again, but it really came to the forefront during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. I know a lot of these animals and people were relocated to Southeast Texas. One of the things that came out of Katrina was the PETS Act, the Pet Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act, because people just won't get off the rooftop and onto the helicopter if they can't take their pets with them. And what the PETS Act now says is that if your county wants FEMA funding for federal disaster relief, you have to have a pet evacuation plan in place as well. And that's working. When Superstorm Sandy hit us on the East Coast a couple years ago, Hurricane Harvey down in Houston a couple years ago, I swear every TV footage I saw of Hurricane Harvey, there was an airboat going through the streets of Houston. There was a black lab in the back. Just over and over again, you saw it. And it's a global phenomenon. These are from Fukushima. I've done a lot of several trainings in Japan, and they were still reeling from the after effects of the tsunami and the nuclear meltdown. We can't possibly imagine the devastation these people went through, but they took their pets with them. And I love these 2 photos on the right. They might be obscured by the thumbnails of our speakers here, but the top one is a woman getting her dog tested for radiation with a Geiger counter. And the bottom one is an elderly woman feeding her dog grains of rice with chopsticks. This is what we mean by the human-animal bond at its most powerful moments. The link connects the dots. Like I said, child abuse, elder abuse, and domestic violence have always been, separated, and animal cruelty has always been the outlier there, because people say, oh, it's only a dog, it's only a cat, I'm working with human needs, they're more important. But even within the human services field, Those people didn't start getting together until the early 1990s and realized that their work overlapped. But again, the animal cruelty was still on the outside. Well, the link brings it together with this overlapping model that shows that when animals are abused, people are at risk. When people are abused, animals are at risk. It's what we call a species spanning approach to preventing all forms of family violence. Animal abuse is the tip of the iceberg. And whoever does that investigation of animal cruelty in a community, whether it's an SPCA, a humane society, law enforcement, animal control, animal services, will often find other forms of abuse bubbling up below the surface, as well as many other family problems. There is no uniform definition of cruelty. Texas is a very unusual state for this. There are two sets of animal cruelty laws, one for livestock and one for non-livestock. And I've never been able to figure out why there are these two sets of laws parallel, but the agriculture industry, of course, is extremely powerful in Texas. The best definition I've ever seen, this came from a British veterinary dictionary. It's the infliction of pain or distress unnecessarily, but the definition of unnecessary varies from time to time and place to place and culture to culture. And the prevailing standards can only be set by the courts. And we see that in a place like Texas. You know, what rural ranchers in West Texas and what an urban dweller in the Dallas Metroplex think are animal cruelty can be 180 degrees apart. And so what the public thinks, what the law says, what the professionals investigating it determine can be widely different. And it makes it extremely difficult to process and prosecute animal cruelty cases. Like I said, there are all these different numbers to call. Most people don't know who to call anyway. And most reports of animal abuse are actually neglect as opposed to outright physical abuse or animal sexual abuse. And yes, we are talking about sexual abuse of animals as well. We got here, it's been a long process. This is nothing really new. Back in the 1300s, St. Thomas Aquinas was talking about how little boys who hurt animals often grow up to become abusive adults. But the great anthropologist Margaret Mead back in 1964 said it as good as anybody. She said one of the most dangerous things that can happen to a child is to kill or torture an animal and get away with it. In the 1970s, we started thinking about what was called the McDonald Triad. This was a theory developed by a psychologist named McDonald that found that the early childhood histories of many criminals had these histories of bedwetting, arson, and animal abuse. And for some reason, they seem to be linked. That has sort of fallen out of favor these days, but you'll still come across that from time to time. In the 1980s, we started looking at serial killers and found out that, yep, a significant number of them did in fact start out torturing animals and just was ignored at the time because they just thought, oh, it's only a squirrel. The terrible school shootings started in the 1990s, and one study found that 43% of these youths are also torturing animals. That is just a tremendous overlap and a risk factor. And we started seeing the domestic violence community start to get interested in animal abuse as an issue because women were coming to the shelters with their pets and they were being turned away because there was no place for them to stay in the shelters. In the 2000s, we came along with the National Link Coalition. We started looking at what's called social capital and how pets build healthier communities and how people feel safer when they see their neighbors walking their dogs. In the 2010s, we began to link animal abuse with histories of bullying, and it's not just youths who bully others who you would expect to be more aggressive, but kids who've been bullied by others take out that aggression on animals. It's been linked with corporal punishment. We're linking animal sex abuse and child pornography and child sexual abuse. The FBI in 2018 linked animal abuse with terrorism. And in 2016, the FBI began to add 4 types of animal cruelty into their national database system. So we will finally, in time, begin to get a handle on actually how many cases of animal abuse there are out there. Well, where we are today is looking at 7 distinct types of animal cruelty. I'm sorry, 7 distinct forms of the link. In the domestic violence field, it's this issue of power and control where the women and the children are trapped They don't feel they can escape. As many as 48% of battered women say they don't leave because they're afraid of what will happen to them, to their pets. It's a form of emotional extortion. And we see the same thing in child sexual abuse, where the perpetrator tells the little boy or little girl that if they talk, he'll strangle her bunny. And the child has to choose between her or his own victimization and the death of their pet. We have what we call adverse childhood experiences. The act of a child perpetrating or witnessing animal cruelty can be devastating. It's one of the earliest signs of conduct disorder. And it starts showing up at about the age of 6.5. We have this issues with bullying. We have the problem of animal hoarding, which can affect any population, any age group, but it's often senior citizens who are isolated and they are lonely and scared, and they just surround themselves with animals because they offer non-judgmental affection. We have dog fighting and cockfighting, which, as bad as it is for the animal's welfare, is often linked with homicides, sex trafficking, prostitution, narcotics, gambling, weapons offenses, and many other crimes. And children and women in the household are exposed to all that. And then this area of animal sex abuse. There are people out there who prefer to have sex with animals, and it is now illegal in 46 states. 47 states. Wyoming just signed into law a ban on having sex with animals just 2 weeks ago. It is still legal in New Mexico. We have 2 bills in Hawaii and West Virginia that are working their way through their state legislatures right now. But it is a felony to have sex with animals in Texas. And it's often linked with child pornography and child sex abuse. Animal abuse often indicates other crimes. Some studies from Chicago are pretty dramatic, and I'm sure Dallas or Fort Worth, the numbers wouldn't be much different. With a significant number of search warrants for animal abuse or dog fighting, winding up seizing illegal guns and narcotics, or offenders who had prior histories. One study in Chicago found that 31% of teenagers in some neighborhoods had been to dog fights. So this animal abuse exposes families that are in trouble, families experiencing other forms of violence, people who are at risk of themselves and others. Victims and witnesses are much more comfortable talking about the abuse of their animals than about what happened to them, because they get defensive when people ask about what happened to them, but they do have the sympathy for the animals. Like I mentioned, it begins early in childhood. It starts showing up about the age of 6.5. And of course, it inflicts pain and suffering on all the victims of the family. A study in Nashville many years ago was looking at how to prevent domestic violence, because they were having a tremendous increase in the number of women who were killed as a result of domestic violence incidents. And they identified 3 risk factors that they felt were the top 3 indicators that a woman might be killed. And so when a woman called the prevention hotline, the domestic violence hotline in Nashville, they asked her these 3 questions. Has he threatened suicide? Does he have access to weapons? And does he threaten to mutilate or kill the pets? And if she answered yes to any of those, they put a special high priority on the case. Well, after 1 year, the numbers are pretty dramatic. The number of calls coming into the crisis line increased 50%. We don't know whether it was because there was more domestic violence or just better reporting systems. But even though the number of calls went up 50%, the number of fatalities decreased 80%. That's how strong a risk factor this is for death in a domestic violence situation. Common wisdom is that people start out hurting animals and they need bigger and bigger thrills when they move on hurting people. Well, a study in Massachusetts took a look at that and found that isn't exactly the case. They looked at 153 people who'd abused animals and looked at their criminal records for 10 years before and 10 years afterwards, and they expected to find 2 things. They expected to find the animal abusers were far more likely to have other criminal issues, and that the animal abuse came first and then the human crimes occurred. Well, the first part was true. 70% of the animal abusers had other criminal records compared to a control group of non-animal abusers, 22%. But the second part was the opposite happened. They found the other crime came first in the majority of cases. And so there are two schools of thought with this in the world of psychology. In some cases, it's called the graduation hypothesis. They start out hurting animals, they graduate into more violence against people. Or it could be just part of a pattern of general deviance and part of a whole constellation of antisocial behaviors. So we can't say that animal abuse always leads to human violence. We can't say that every little boy who kicks the cat is going to grow up to become a serial killer. But we're not surprised when we do find these links. I'll give you a couple of case studies. These are from my old hometown of the Philadelphia area. This is from a suburb of Philly, Upper Dublin Township in Montgomery County. It was a bitterly cold night in January, and the neighbors called the police because they were worried about the welfare of a Great Dane. And if you look in the lower left-hand corner of that picture there, there's a homemade doghouse. The dog was out there freezing on this bitterly cold night. So they called the police. Police came. The police called the Montgomery County SPCA. They took the dog away. Police went in the house and found a dead 4-year-old boy who had been beaten to death. Reverend Javnik Burroughs and his wife had 7 children, 4 of their own and 3 foster children. And don't ask me how they got into the foster care system, but 6 of the 7 children had been beaten over the course of their young lives. They fled from the Philly area, wound up in Atlanta, were extradited back to Pennsylvania. He was convicted and got 22 years in prison for the death of the child. But that's not the end of the story. First part of the story is the animal welfare investigation triggered the homicide case. The second part of the story is this: 4 years prior to this incident, he had been convicted of domestic violence. And 4 years before that, he had been convicted of animal cruelty. And none of the agencies in Montgomery County were talking to each other. They had their blinders on, and they just were not communicating with each other. Another case from Philly. As Sandra Ruotolo explained to the judge, she was thinking of her dogs when she pulled the trigger. For 13 years, her husband battered her, but one night he not only whipped her with a vacuum cleaner cord, he also punched one of her 4 German Shepherds and warned her that if she left, he would find her and slit one of the dog's throats in front of her. Later that night, as her husband slept, she loaded a .38 caliber pistol and pointed it at herself. A moment away from suicide, she looked at her eldest dog and said, "Duchess, if I die, what's going to happen to you?" And so instead, she walked in her husband's bedroom and shot him. And she got 10 to 20 years for 3rd-degree murder. This just shows the intensity of these relationships and these problems and how the animals become pawns in the power and control of domestic violence. And this is what this intergenerational cycle of violence looks like in domestic violence. The batterer harms or threatens the animal, so the survivors stay. The children are exposed to both the domestic violence and the animal abuse. They become violent or victims themselves, and they grow up and repeat the whole cycle over and over and over again. I don't know if you're familiar with what's called the Duluth Model. This was developed by a domestic violence agency in Duluth, Minnesota many years ago, when everybody thought domestic violence was just physical violence, a man applying physical force to a woman. But what this showed was that no, it's really all about power and control. Yes, there is often physical abuse, but there are also these other 8 forms of abuse that are involved in intimate partner violence. And we've modified this to show how animals fit into it. We have the area of coercion and threats, where he'll threaten to harm or kill the pet if she leaves or asserts any independence, or the pet may just mysteriously disappear one day. We have the isolation factor. He'll refuse to allow her to take the pet to the vet or to keep her from going to the doggy park and taking advantage of the amazing socialization that happens when people and animals get together. He'll inflict emotional abuse on her. He'll call her derogatory pet names, take away the pet that might be her only source of unconditional love, or force her to watch animal pornography or even have sex with the animals as a way to further humiliate her. There'll be economic abuse. He won't allow her to spend money on the pet's welfare, won't allow her to go to the vet, and then blame her when the animal gets sick. He'll intimidate her by warning her that next time it could be you. He'll drag the children into this. He'll harm or kill the children's pet and blame mom and use that to drive a wedge between her and the children. He'll deny it, blame somebody else. And then we have legal issues. Who owns this pet? If this gets down to a bitter custody dispute, who's going to claim it? And I have been in shelters, animal shelters, where one party brings the pet in and puts it up for adoption so the other party won't get it in the divorce settlement. We have a solution to that, which I'll talk about here in a second. There are a lot of reasons why she doesn't leave, a lot of reasons why she goes back. And it's very complex. There are a tremendous number of barriers, and everybody in the domestic violence field has heard this all before. You know, oh, he's getting better. He didn't mean to do it. It was really my fault. It was just a one-time thing. And what we need to be telling these women is this. Look, if he's hurting harmless animals, it's not your fault. It's his fault. And you and the kids and the pets need to get out of there as quickly as you can. Like I said, as many as 48% of battered women and their children stay trapped in these toxic relationships because they're afraid of what will happen to their animals if they leave. One study found that they're trying to identify what are the biggest risk factors for somebody becoming a domestic violence abuser, and they identified 4. The first 3 didn't surprise them: low education level, history of substance abuse, and history of mental health issues. The 4th one they hadn't expected. It's this threat or actual harm to animals. It's one of the 4 biggest risk factors for becoming a domestic violence abuser. Second study here was actually done in Texas and found that batterers who also abuse animals are more dangerous. They use more controlling behaviors and more forms of violence. And a recent study in Indianapolis found that police officers really hate to go onto a domestic violence scene because it's an extremely dangerous time for the cops. The risk of the officers dying in a domestic violence shootout doubles when animal abuse is also involved in the mix. Study in Utah looked at these numbers here. 71% of women in shelters in the state reported the animals had been killed or harmed, but almost as frightening as that, 32% of them, almost a third of them, reported that their children had hurt or killed the animals. And a study in Wisconsin found that the animal abuse overwhelmingly occurred in the presence of the women and the children to intimidate them and keep them under control. This was from a study in New Zealand, and I use this to show this is a global issue. It's not just the United States. And the abusers target the animals because they can, because they're convenient, and frankly, because it works. It keeps up a culture of violence, keeps up the norm in that family, keeps the whole family hostage. He'll do it to get revenge against her or family and friends who help her escape. He'll do it because he's jealous, because she's more emotionally attached to the animals than she is to him. And they do it because they believe the cops don't care about the animals. And unfortunately, in many cases, they are sadly right. The cops don't care. So some key points here. Animal abuse also hurts people. It's not just an animal issue. It is one of the 4 forms of family violence. We need to think of the impact of animal abuse perpetrated or witnessed by children as impacting their long-term physical and emotional health. Recognizing and responding to animal abuse earlier is a much better way to help families in trouble. But interventions when animals are involved require some really creative solutions by human services advocates who understand animals and people's attachment to them. And so we're doing a lot of training for social workers and people in the social services field. And we're encouraging them to fill in pieces of the puzzle. And when people call a crisis line, an intake at a shelter, and doing an assessment, a referral, ask these 3 questions to fill in the pieces of the puzzle. Are there animals at home? How are they cared for? And are you worried about their welfare? Because the way people relate to their animals opens up a tremendous window into how they relate to each other and gives you an amazing view as to what the environment at home is really like. Asking people on crisis lines and hotlines about how many animals they're there, their relationships, how they're cared for. Do they come and go? Have they developed long-term relationships with them? Have any disappeared? Are they worried about what will happen to them? Observing them if they're doing site visits and seeing how people relate to them. See if they need any help with either their pets or their livestock. In groups like the Texas SPCA or the other humane or animal services groups in the Dallas Metroplex have all sorts of resources available to help these animals when necessary. and they need to know who to call for this help, and that's why we have the directory. For domestic violence victim advocates, we're telling them several key things. Help their clients establish ownership. Get all the paperwork in their name, the license, the microchip, the rabies shots, the vet bills, the pet food bills, the pedigree papers. The more that we can get in her name instead of his will help her prove that she is the primary caregiver if we get to a point where there's a bitter custody dispute or she needs a protection order that includes the pets. And we have that now in Texas and 34 other states. We are encouraging domestic violence agencies to include pets in their safety planning. Safety planning is this concept in the domestic violence shelter field that gives women handy tips on how to get out of the house at a moment's notice, which has just a few spare minutes that she can escape. The animals, toys, and supplies, and records, and bedding, and pet food, and equipment needs to be included with all that. We can invite animal-assisted therapy teams into domestic violence shelters. We can identify pet-friendly transition housing and permanent housing for domestic violence survivors. And there's a great resource guide out there. It's called apartmentguide.com. You can type in any city in this country if you're looking for an apartment and enter how much you're willing to pay for rent and how many bedrooms and bathrooms and square footage, but also whether it needs to be pet friendly or not. And this will help domestic violence survivors be able to move on and heal with their pets. We're encouraging people in social services to not minimize people's relationships with animals, but treat the death or disappearance of a pet as serious as the death or disappearance of a human family member, because for many people, it is just as traumatic. We're encouraging schools of social work to include the human-animal bond in their curriculum and to include animal care and control agencies in coordinated community response teams. I mentioned pet protective orders. These started in Maine in 2006, and today 35 states have laws on the books that allow courts to include pets in domestic violence protection from abuse orders. And I just learned today there's a bill in the Pennsylvania legislature. There's one in Missouri as well. And with luck, we'll have 37 states here in the not too distant future. But Texas came on board with 2011. And so women needing protection orders in domestic violence can have their pets included in that. The feds came on board in 2018 with a federal law on this, the Pet and Women's Safety Act, which says these pet protection orders can now be enforced across state lines. So a woman in Texas who has a protection order, if she goes into New Mexico, it can still be enforced. And the federal government is joining the private sector and is making $2.5 million available each year to help domestic violence shelters build kennels to be able to house family pets. In 10 states, an act of animal abuse, that's coercive control in a domestic violence situation, can also be prosecuted as domestic violence. In 2 states, we have the same thing with elder abuse. And I mentioned who gets custody in a divorce case. Alaska started this in 2016, followed by Illinois, New Hampshire, and California. These 4 states now say courts can award custody of pets in a divorce in the animal's best interest. And it's the same idea that we have awarding child custody in what would be in the best interest of the child. That's been a major step forward. We're increasing community awareness. This was a campaign in Baltimore a number of years ago. The police department in Baltimore set up its first victim services unit for domestic violence victims. And they were all set to go to press with these posters that showed a woman and a child cowering in the corner, the shadow of the guy looming over them, and telling them, you know, if you're having a domestic violence issue, don't be afraid of the police. Call us. We're here to help. We have victim services. Well, the woman who headed this program came to one of our link trainings and the light bulb went on in her head. Said, why didn't I think of this before? And now through the wonders of Photoshop, there's a dog in the posters. Just a remarkably simple and easy technique to make it happen. The latest area of the link is what we call DV and the DVM. We're finally starting to see veterinarians get interested in recognizing their responsibility in reporting possible animal abuse. But because 70% of women in vet schools 70% of students in vet schools right now are women, and because we've had some cases of domestic violence coming in the door of a vet clinic. We're trying to train veterinarians to be responsive to domestic violence as well. This started in New Zealand back in 2015 when the New Zealand Veterinary Association defined veterinary medicine as a three-dimensional profession, a unique voice that transcends animal life, human life, and the environment, and they signed on to a national domestic violence prevention initiative in New Zealand. Next year, Scotland put £1 million into a national campaign to fight domestic violence, and they decided to use this money to train the frontline workers in the three professions most likely to encounter an abused woman. Then they had to identify what three professions might that be. Well, it turns out the three professions most likely to encounter abused women are beauticians, dentists, and veterinarians. You may have seen this video that went viral in 2018 in Florida. A woman was being held at gunpoint by her boyfriend. She conned him into believing the dog needed to go to the vet, so they went to the vet at gunpoint. She was able to slip a note to the staff saying, "Help, I'm being held. He has a gun. Don't let him know." They were able to put him in one room, her and the dog in another room. Cops came and arrested him. We are trying to get more and more people involved with this. With veterinarians, this is a little difficult to understand this map. There are 18 states, the states in green, including Texas, in which everybody is a mandated reporter of suspected child abuse. But vets going to Texas A&M and don't know that yet. They haven't been trained by the child protection agencies on how to recognize child abuse and how to report it. Veterinarians in Texas are permitted to report suspected animal abuse. They don't have to do it, but at least they're allowed to do it without fear of violating client confidentiality or any of those other strictures there. We have these posters on our website. They can be customized. They're designed for vet hospitals or animal shelters or hospitals or any other place saying this is a hit-free zone. And people don't hit people here and people don't hit their animals here. And you can download these and customize them and put them up in your facilities. It'd be great in churches too. We have this infographic that a veterinarian in Massachusetts created for us and for other veterinarians that they can put up in their clinics showing how the veterinarian has a responsibility to not only protect animal health, but also human health and welfare. Because so many domestic violence shelters did not accept pets and became such an issue, they jumped into the field and created what I whimsically call doggy witness protection programs. And it started with what we call safe havens, and there are several hundred domestic violence agencies now in this country that have a cooperative agreement with local animal shelters or veterinarians or other groups to provide off-site foster care for the animals to remove that barrier so they can escape. But the next step up from that, and one we're really excited about, is called safety, sheltering animals and families together. And a colleague of ours in Michigan, a former prosecutor, started this program. Today, we have 250 shelters in the United States and overseas that actually accept pets and keep the whole family together. There are 12 of these shelters in Texas. And you go to the website, safetyprogram.org, and find out where they are. And Allie, who started this program, Allie Phillips, has a startup manual on her website to help more and more domestic violence shelters become pet friendly, and there's money available from corporate and nonprofit sources for capital construction and to provide grants for individual women to help them escape from abusive situations. We're trying to get domestic violence shelters and animal shelters to work together and bridge the divide between humane and human services. They can do joint fundraisers. I've seen several places in Florida and Ohio, among others, where they do fundraising walk, a 5K walk with your dog, and they split the proceeds. Cross-training and cross-reporting. Get these agencies to talk to each other before cases arise so they know who to call. Displaying each other's literature. There's no reason why animal shelters can't have domestic violence agencies' literature in the lobby, and vice versa. No reason why people from one agency can't serve on the other agency's board and have communications going back and forth. Setting up these lines of communication, identifying pet-friendly housing. It's a way to position the agency as caring for all vulnerable members of the family. There are some great resources out there. This is of particular interest to you. A group out of Los Angeles called the Native America Humane Society. Diana Webster started this program a number of years ago. She's a white bear Ojibwe from Minnesota originally. And check out nativeamericahumane.org. It is the only animal welfare group we know of specifically working with the Native American community. And they can use all the help they can get. And I can give you her, well, there's her website there. Bring her in as one of your speakers sometime. Talk about what kind of work she's doing there. We have local link coalitions. There was a really good active one in Dallas, the North Texas Link Coalition, but unfortunately they went through a leadership change at the Texas SPCA, and that's kind of on hold right now, but there is still a website. They have periodic meetings. It's a good resource for you. Get in touch with them. And again, they need more people to get involved, and they'd love to know of your interest in this. So that's a quick look at all this. I would like to extend an invitation. Feel free to contact me offline. If you'd like to get our link letter, just send me an email. Just let me know you were on this website. And I am available right now for questions and answers. If we want to take the time to do that, I would love to hear what your questions are. So JB, let me turn it back over to you or Linda or whoever.
Okay, thank you. I am stopping the recording now.